Good evening, everyone. And today we are going to talk about section 4 romantic criticism. And it's quite important because definitely you are going to face at least one question based on that, and it will be definitely from either of these. So, Wordsworth or Coleridge or John Keats, and also from Shelley. So we will focus more on them, and but as it's about romantic criticism, we have to talk about all these people too. Then it will build your uh, background, and then you can easily understand all these uh, critics. Got it? So we'll quickly start our session. If anyone is there, say hi in the chat box, or we'll just begin. Anyway, romantic criticism is what? It is related to 19th century British Romanticism introduced what new aesthetic concept to the literary studies, right? Study. And literature can raise a common subject to a sublime level without necessarily being beautiful, noble, or perfect. So in the beginning, it was just simply a European movement in the beginning, and then it started grew from what? Out of German Sturm and Drang movement, favoring intuition and emotion over enlightenment. So before that, it was enlightenment rationalism. Then German Sturm and Drang. Then we have romantic criticism. Then we had the French Revolution, which greatly influenced all the romantics. So there was more importance given to the individual responsibility than to a custom and tradition. So for the first time, we are started talking about the individual. So started with who? The founder of romanticism is Schlegel and Friedrich Schlegel and August Wilhelm Schlegel. So remember these names. Just you have to just know that these Germans are there. So in the 1790s, they began to refer to romantic poesy or romantic poetry, and of course it began in 18th century in English literature. Poets like Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. So I hope you understand who are in romantic criticism. Is our Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake, but it started in Germany by Friedrich Schlegel and August Wilhelm Schlegel. So these are the names which are associated with German Romanticism, and of course in English literature started with early Romantic were Blake, and then we had Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the late Romantics we have Keats, and of course we have Shelley. So it continued into the 19th century with the second generation, who were there Shelley, Keats, and Byron. And of course everything in English literature or England, this romanticism began with the publication of lyrical ballads. But of course we got the term and everything, the explanation from preface to the lyrical ballad, which was published in 1800. And of course the lyrical ballads was published in when 1798, and this was in preface was published in 1800. Just remember the name, quite important. Good evening, Anjali is here. So we are talking about romantic criticism now. So the composition of Hymn to the Night of Novalis, and of course the poetry of William Blake, the poetry of Robert Burns, Rousseau's philosophy of writing, Song of Myself, and Walt Whitman, and the poetry of S.T. Coleridge. So I hope this is the small introduction of romanticism, and some characteristic of romanticism you should understand, that it is all about nature. It glorifies the nature, and of course it is stresses awareness, acceptance of emotions, and it is mainly talking about common person, childhood, and of course it has strong senses, emotions, and feelings, and of course imagination. Nature and imagination is the quite important characteristics of Romanticism. So Romanticism is often talk about emphasizes aesthetic beauty, and of course its central theme is the solitude, and of course of nature, and it celebration of the individual. It focuses on exoticism exoticism and history. It has a spiritual and of course supernatural element, like we see in St. Coleridge poetry. So it depicts vivid sensory description, and also it focuses on the self and autobiography, and it uses personification. And we have August Wilhelm Schlegel. As I told you, he's a German poet translator, and the romanticism began with romantic criticism began with him in Germany. So his translation of Shakespeare plays made them classics in German literature. Besides teaching Sanskrit in continental Europe, Schlegel also translated Bhagavad Gita. So this is just introduction about Schlegel, and that Schlegel wrote what critical fragments, Athenaeum fragments, and on incomprehensibility. So we just have to remember the name and why he is important, because of the German Romanticism, right? And again another one is Friedrich Schiller. Schiller we know, of course, he was a German playwright, poet and philosopher. And John Wolfgang Goethe, who was already famous and influential, developed a product of the complex friendship with Schiller. So just you have to remember the name, not anything about it. And of course letter, so he was the one who talked about aestheticism, education of man in the letter. So letters on the aesthetic education of man, and it is about the great disenchantment inspired Schiller's feeling about the French Revolution. And he wrote, a great moment has found a little people. And the letters present aesthetic education as the means to help humanity to attain political freedom. One more is there, Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel this time, and of course he is German, and they are all German Romanticism, and his brother is Schlegel, and they are the prominent figure of what early Romanticism were in Germany. Simple. Again, one is Friedrich Wilhelm Schelling this time. Another, so many names are there, you don't have to worry about, just for your general interest. So he was a German philosopher again, Wilhelm Schelling, and then the evolving nature of Schelling's philosophy makes it difficult to interpret. So he wrote on the relation of the plastic arts of nature. Now our main topic is William Blake. Quite important, of course, because of his poetry, and as we know, his poetry is like mostly symbolic and all, and he's also early romantic. And why he's mentioned here in criticism? Because of his couple of work like The Marriage of Hell and Heaven, and of course the descriptive catalog, quite important. And of course Blake wrote a letter to Thomas Butt, and so that's why he's. And Arthur Fry, a 20th century critic, described or hailed him as prophetic, his prophetic work as what is in proportion to its merits the least read body of poetry in English language. So remember, William Blake is important in criticism only because of one work, The Marriage of Hell and Marriage of Heaven and Hell. So amid the French Revolution, this work was composed between first is 1790 and 1793. Remember, if they ask the order, it is early romantic work, and somewhere between 1790 to 1793. and a reference to Emanuel Swedenborg, who also wrote Heaven and Hell, is ironically included in the title. And what it is the collection of texts based on biblical prophecies. And what do you find in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell? That here Blake expresses what his own intensely personal, romantic, and revolutionary beliefs. So the book opens with what? Rintar roars, shakes his fires in the burdened air. Just opening line. And Blake claims, and why the Marriage of Heaven and Hell is famous, is important in literary criticism and romantic criticism, because of this thing, because of just this phrase that you have to remember. And who said about Blake said about Milton that Milton was a true poet, and that Paradise Lost was the devil's party without knowing it. So because of that only, that the Marriage of Hell is quite famous. So you should definitely write this devil's party without knowing him, and it is about Milton. Who said this? Blake. So that is important that you have to know about this work. So anyway, most of the book is written in prose except for the opening argument and the Song of Liberty. And Blake uses device of description, poet's visit to hell, which is taken directly from Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. I hope you understood William Blake and why he is important in romantic criticism. He is, of course, an early romantic critic, and of course he is famous for one statement about Milton, that he said that Milton is the devil's party without knowing it, or his work Paradise Lost was of the devil's party without knowing it. And this was said in the work called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was published in 1793, and I hope you understood about that. Now we have William Wordsworth. Like most of you already, you have read so much about Wordsworth and Wordsworth poetry, and especially you know him mostly about criticism, and we are quite familiar with the lyrical ballads, right? And here we are going to talk about the preface, and also the dates are quite important in that lyrical ballad, that you should understand that the lyrical ballad first published in 1798, but with the preface it was published in 1800. That question is like must, you should know that you might get, and of course in previous net on they have asked about it already, so that is important for you. And again, Wordsworth visited Switzerland, France during the summer while studying at Cambridge University, and as a result he became a fan of the French Revolution while at school, and he wrote a poetry, but none of it was published until 1793. And as we know, Wordsworth and his sister lived together in Dorset in 1795 after receiving a legacy from a close relative. So anyway, they moved to the Somerset 2 years later to live near Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and because of that we know the Lake Poets, right, and admired Wordsworth's writing. And of course we know the prelude, that his Wordsworth magnum opus, and he revised and expanded the prelude many times over his early years. And that prelude is semi-autobiographical poem. We're just introducing him, and we'll just move quickly to the preface. So anyway, after his death, His wife retitled, and that retitled name was known as the Poem to Coleridge. And as we know, couple of poems here. I wandered lonely as a cloud, and which was written at Dove Cottage. And we know him, and he also served as the poet laureate between 1843 to 1850. Now we come to our main topic, where you will find one question like 100%. Anyway, so the preface to Lyrical Ballad, date is important, 1800. And the second edition was published in 1801 and is often referred to as 1800 edition. Just remember the date, 1800. The preface was added in 1800. And as we know, this Lyrical Ballads is the collection of poetry, lyrical ballads, and then later Wordsworth greatly expanded it into third edition, which was published in 1808. So as a result, it become regarded as the de facto manifesto. So that the preface is known as the manifesto of the Romantic moment. So that question also has come in the exam. So S.T. Coleridge, Wordsworth were inspired to create this book, poetry, through many intellectual conversations. And Lyrical Ballad, this contains of only 4 Coleridge poems, and the remaining are by Wordsworth. These are the important, the things you already know. We are just building up our discussion. So anyway, after Wordsworth wrote the Lyrical Ballads, Coleridge wanted to write a preface to clarify his poetic style and dispel many criticism about their new work. So Coleridge discusses, he said, this is all the beginning of the artificiality and impermanence of poetic fashion and aristocratic taste shills. And in his view, Wordsworth and his poetry were more accurate and lasting. Although Coleridge had conceived of the idea, he never wrote the preface, leaving Wordsworth with minimal time to complete. So actually, it was the plan was that Coleridge has to write the preface, but he didn't write, and at the end, Wordsworth has to write the preface. And that's why we have that preface, and that preface was published in 1800, and that was again refined in 1802. And following the publication of Wordsworth preface, Coleridge expressed his disagreement. So when he published, Wordsworth published the preface, Coleridge was against it. He actually didn't agree with the statement or whatever the preface Wordsworth wrote. So the disagreement when it through his writing of Biographia Literaria. So that preface actually inspired Coleridge to write Biographia Literaria and other letters and essays. I hope you understand till here. And there are some differences between Coleridge and Wordsworth opinions, though they do not entirely clash. So that's why we are learning S.T. Coleridge Biographia Literaria and Wordsworth the preface, the Lyrical Ballad together. So in that way you will understand more about it. So anyway, simple. The manifesto of that romanticism is your preface, and that include how many? 4 guidelines. And the guidelines is simple, not so much to, you can just write in the chat box like in a code. So the guideline is, poetry is best suited to ordinary life. So you can just write poetry and then dash, is ordinary life in the chat box, and then he uses the common man language. Simple, ordinary, common. Just write poetry, ordinary, common man's language, or common man, just simple. And the second is poetry is best written in everyday language. So just make a code: poetry, ordinary, common man's everyday language. And the third is feeling are more important than plot or action. And the last one is poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion that takes its origin from emotion recollect in tranquility. That is fine. So poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion that takes its origin from emotion. That is quite important, quite like most important. It's the backbone of the preface. The poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions. Got it? And we'll just move quickly, and all these guidelines of this manifesto will talk in detail. So Wordsworth, सबसे पहले, the first thing what he did, he just rejected all 18th century poem. Like at that time the poetry was more like you can say in symbolic. There was so many like proper traditional form, everything was written like that before Wordsworth. Then Wordsworth said that poetry should be read by everyone, right? And it is for everyone. And the poetry should be easy, should be understandable, that every common man can understand that. So that thing, because of that, he rejected all this style of 18th century poetry and formed an understandable art that we know as the form for the ordinary man. So when you read Wordsworth, the poems are quite small, very small line, very good language. You understand what he wants to say. So the first manifesto or first guideline of the manifesto is clear now. Wordsworth remarks that personification of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes, and they usually are utterly rejected as an ordinary device to elevate the style and raise it above praise. And that was line 9, preface. So the author explains why and how he chose his subjects of poetry. So in the manifesto, he explains why he chose all these poetry, all these subject of these poetry, and why he chose to write in that way, the simple ordinary way. So Wordsworth believes that emotional truths and fidelity to nature offer insight into the lives of ordinary man. And Wordsworth prefers that rural life over urban life. So again, like he says, rural is greater than urban, right? That sign for the code. So rural, you can write in the chat box if you have time, but anyway, just understand that he prefers rural life over urban life because it is simpler and more natural. So again, Wordsworth also favors more unified common population with similar experiences, and the permanence of natural truth is absent in critics like London, where the population is rapidly cities, not critics. So anyway, the permanence of natural truths is absent in cities like London, where the population is rapidly expanding. And Wordsworth, what he sought to make ordinary experience. So whatever the ordinary subject he has taken, from ordinary man, he to make ordinary experience appear more extraordinary and lasting. So these small subject, that ordinary subject that he took, he made it more extraordinary and lasting, and through especially common language, everyday language for common people. So Wordsworth new literature would share people's lives, simplicity and depth, just as nature illustrates permanence and unchanging truth. And again, Wordsworth expresses poetry must derive from where the the phrase that Priya wrote, poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, it takes its origin from emotion, recollect in tranquility. And that statement is quite famous, and it has been not explained, but chapter number 14 is there, right, in the Biographia Literaria, where he talked about primary imagination, and St. Coleridge talked about primary imagination, and of course secondary imagination, and how poetry is formed through those. And there is fancy and imagination that we'll talk about. So this is all from that itself. So a poet must reminisce emotion or passion, not simply record observation. So the poet must describe a real life experience with ordinary language. So everything you see all about ordinary, right? So the poet must throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind is an unusual aspects. So through the use of imagination, the poet can create worlds that are new and connect people to the world around them. And of course, the poet observes something that provokes an emotion, and then he tranquility contemplate and reflect on the emotion. So during this time, the poet may recall other things related to the observation itself or the past. So the contemplation is personal, intended only for the poet. And after a while, the tranquility of reflection disappears. And to create a universal expression of the original emotion, the poet distills all these thoughts and eliminating some and keeping others. So finally, what? The poet is ready to write and share the emotion with the audience. So as a result, poetry doesn't emerge from classical models of all form and big languages and all. He says that it emerges from what? From ordinary people, ordinary emotions. So experiencing it on an ordinary level entails understanding and reflecting on it. So Wordsworth examines his views on poetry and prose. He rejects what? Past distinction, such as being more heroic or having more higher arts in form and to compose all these poetry than the other. So he aims to reveal both as sharing the fundamental characteristics of a language. So we are just concluding Wordsworth with some of the quote, like poetry into a man is speaking to a man, and this is also important. This has been asked in net. A man is speaking to men. A man is speaking to men. He effectively removes the lines diverging prose from poetry. One important key point is that Wordsworth considers the use of meters produce a forced type of verse rather than the naked, more straightforward poetry that shares truth with prose. And Wordsworth exemplifies that he chooses to write poetry with a proper and natural poetic diction rather than prose. At the end of the preface, Wordsworth writes, "They both speak by and to the same organs. Their affection are kindred and almost identical, not necessarily differing even in degree." So the preface at the end concludes with the statement that the essential principle of his art, made up of imagination, sentiment, will employ the exact natural language of meter or prose, regardless of whether he arrive in prose or verse. I hope you understood Wordsworth preface. Now we are talking about Coleridge. Let me see. Already half an hour over. We'll be able to come. Let me see. It's like a lot of left in this section. Anyway, we'll just start with Coleridge. What is time? 5:42. Okay, S.T. Coleridge. We'll just begin with S.T. Coleridge now. So, S.T. Coleridge. Of course, we know him because of the Ancient Mariner, of course, and of course we know him. Sorry for the disturbance. Okay, as we know, he's English philosopher, poet, religious and political theorist. But we know him as here poet and critic, and we leave the other. And he attended the University of Cambridge. Important. And Coleridge met with Wordsworth in 1795, and they were they collaborated closely. And in the wake of Wordsworth, Coleridge poetry took on more conversational voice and began to find inspiration in everyday life. And from 1797 and 98, they published what? They together lived in Somersetshire, close to Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. He published his first poetry collection, which was various subject poems on various subject, 1796. And Coleridge and Wordsworth worked together were in Lyrical Ballad, which was published in 1798. And Coleridge intended to compose a series of lyric poems that explored the romantic and supernatural and sought to achieve readers' poetic faith. So this is all introduction of Coleridge, little bit about his literary career. And Wordsworth intended to employ the self and everyday as his subject in his poem. Anyway, they thought pairing these technique might bring into harmony. So the two cardinal points of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. So as we know, Wordsworth composed many poems, and we have Coleridge has composed only 4 poems, including Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Okay, so that was all about Wordsworth, and now we'll talk about Biographia Literaria. We'll just move quickly to know that Biographia Literaria published in 1817, and it is simple. Working title in the beginning was Autobiographia Literaria, but eventually published as, and also it has the subtitle called Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinion. That question has been asked in the net. Alludes the same, the life and opinion of Tristram Shandy, gentleman, by Lawrence. So this is actually alludes the title. So this title was inspired by Lawrence Sterne, the life and the opinion of Tristram Shandy. So Wordsworth theory of poetry, Kant's concept of imagination as a powerful shaping force were key influence. So when he wrote this work, who influenced more? Kant's concept of imagination and Wordsworth form of poetry, that he took the subject from the ordinary life, right? And also from ordinary language, from ordinary people or common man, or common man speaks to common man to man. So anyway, Coleridge later coined the remember that term is quite important, most important in literary Biographia Literaria. Exemplastic, by various post-Kantian writers including Schelling, Hartley, and we have, if you read Biographia Literaria, you'll find these critics also. So Coleridge's critical works written monumental, including, remember, it has 24 chapter in Biographia Literaria. So write in the chat 24, and then we'll talk about more. So in this vital disquisition, Coleridge examines what himself with the practice of criticism and its theory. The first volume focuses primarily on philosophical development that we don't need. Why this is important? Because of the chapter 14, which has what? Imagination, fancy, primary, secondary imagination, all these that we have to know about it. So he believed that the self-sufficing power of absolute genius and acknowledged talent and genius were like an egg and eggshell. Chapter 14 is important for us, that we are going to discuss. Remember that they have already asked 2 cardinal points. The first chapter, 2 cardinal points, and it starts with what? The ability to evoke sympathy in the reader by faithfully adhering to nature's truth. And the second was the ability to explore novelty by modifying with imagination's colors. Right? And he also says there's a subject for these poems were to come from ordinary life. He also talked about there was a second type of poetry where the incident and agents were supernatural. And these 2 cardinal points are the subject of the poem, the lyrical ballad. So he talked about lyrical ballad in Biographia Literaria, but Coleridge defended Wordsworth's poetic creed in chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, despite disagreeing with Wordsworth's thought on poetic diction. So he was only against the poetic diction, but he supported Wordsworth's preface in Biographia Literaria. So Coleridge supported Wordsworth's lyrical ballads in language of real life, but he was against the, and also it was, so Coleridge supports Wordsworth the lyrical ballad in a language for real life, because at that time Wordsworth was criticized by other critics. So here we have two words, fancy and imagination, that you have to pay attention. Remember, this is all credited by from where who? Kant, Fichte and Schelling, and with coining the famous definition of imagination. So imagination and fancy, however, differ in kind. So now we begin. There is no creative power in fancy. So according to Coleridge, there is no creative power in fancy. So fancy is like some artificial thing. So it only combines what it perceives into beautiful shape. So I don't know how to take example for it, but simply whatever we in fancy, we make things beautiful, but it doesn't come from your imagination, but it's just fancy. The imagination is something different, does not fuse and unify, and mechanical mixture and chemical compounds differ in the same way. So according to Coleridge, imagination has two, primary and secondary. So write in the chat box primary and secondary quickly. So he divided imagination into two types, and which are the primary imagination and secondary imagination. So we'll just pay more attention into all these little. So starting with primary imagination is simply what? Quite important. Primary imagination is the ability to perceive the external world through the senses. So the ability to perceive objects of a sense in their parts and entirely. So remember, primary imagination is ability to perceive external world through the senses. And fancy is what? Fancy is to be inferior. So he says that fancy to be inferior to the imagination. And according to him, fancy is what? It is according to him that it is a creative power. So fancy is all like shaping into some beautiful things, right? So it only combines different things into different shapes, not like imagination fusing them into one. So according to him, fancy is what? Is the process of bringing together images dissimilar in the main by sources or source. What is primary imagination? Primary imagination is the nature and function of imagination which distinguishes it from fancy. So again, imagination has two forms, again, primary and secondary. Primary is what? The ability to receive impression of the external world through what? Through senses. So simply primary imagination, PI/senses, or dash senses. Write in the chat box PI or primary imagination through senses. We use our primary imagination to perceive things in the world, in the daily world. So world daily. We use our primary imagination to perceive things in the world daily. And perceiving objects of the senses, so perceiving objects of sense in both their parts and as a whole is the ability to perceive them. And primary imagination is an evaluationary act of the mind. The human mind unconsciously, involuntarily receives impression and sensation from the outside world. So all the imagination, that primary imagination, are coming from the senses, right? And it imposes some order on those impressions and reduces them to shape and size, so the mind can form a clear image of the outside world. And here comes our important one, is the secondary images. So actually it is secondary imagination where the poetry comes, where the real art is there, where in secondary imagination. So primary imagination is universal, all the secondary imagination possess it. On the other hand, it may be possessed by other also. So it is the peculiar and distinctive attribute of the artist, and secondary imagination makes artistic creation possible. So all the art happens when in secondary imagination. So in the secondary imagination we create poem, we create painting, and all these things is in secondary imagination. So it is more active and conscious in its work. So write secondary imagination, or SI dash artistic creation, and it is more active, conscious in its work. It requires an effort of will. Okay. And primary imagination works with what is perceived, and primary imagination provides its raw material as sensation. So what happens in primary imagination, you get all these imagination as in a raw form, and in secondary imagination what you do, you select all that primary imaginations images or picture, whatever you have collected, you reject some of them and you collect some of them. So the secondary imagination selects and orders raw material that it should reshape and remodel it with the aid of the will and the intellect. And here our important term is here exemplistic power. And exemplistic is simply what? The shapes and modifies object in the external world by exerting plastic stress and immersive them in glory and dream that has never existed on land or sea. I hope you understand what is secondary imagination, and what happens in secondary imagination is that it is an active agent that dissolve, diffuse and dissipates in order to recreate. Quite very important this phrases. So what is secondary imagination? What happens? Your imagination comes from what? Primary imagination. And what happens there? It dissolves, diffuse, dissipate in order to create. What happens in secondary imagination? So all poetic activity, everything through the art, about art is coming from this secondary imagination. I hope it is clear now, secondary imagination. And if this term is clear, your whole Biographia Literaria is almost done, and you won't make mistake answering that. So it is the power of which harmonize and reconciles opposites, hence the magical synthetic power. So a significant feature of the imagination is the ability to integrate and synthesize the faculties of the soul, perception, intellect and will and emotion, fuse the internal with the external. So the subjective with the objective, and the human mind with external nature, the spiritual with the physical and material. John Keats is there, negative capability and the Four Age of Poetry. B.B. Shelley, Defense of Poesy. Okay, the rest we'll do tomorrow. For now it's enough. We'll do the rest tomorrow. Okay, for now, bye bye and take care.